And now I'd like to introduce our facilitator, Kim Helfgott.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Kim Helfgott, and I'm the Child Welfare Resource Specialist for the Technical Assistance Partnership for Child and Family Mental Health. And I'm pleased to be able to moderate this call today on promoting resilience in children and youth who experience childhood abuse. Pat Stanilewski is the current Director of Partnering for Prevention, a new organization to promote collaboration among child abuse and neglect prevention organizations. She was formerly the administrator for the Office of Early Childhood Services in New Jersey and coordinated the Children's Trust Fund in New Jersey and was part of a strengthening initiative, a Strengthening Families initiative, which really promotes ways in which child care providers and parents can work together to make a great team for supporting young children. I recently saw this presentation on promoting resilience in children and youth that was shared by Pat, and I was really moved because it presents such a hopeful picture about ways to strengthen families and support young people, particularly those young people who have experienced child maltreatment, in ways that can lead to better outcomes. And it's something that every system of care community, I thought, would really benefit and learn from. Next slide. We know from our national evaluation conducted for all system of care communities that approximately 30% of the children within systems of care communities have been referred by a child welfare agency, are in a child welfare agency, or currently in foster care. And there's been so much research that's been done about the impact of child maltreatment. Much of this research you can find on the Child Welfare Information Gateway at www.childwelfare.gov that talks specifically about the impact of child maltreatment. We know that the immediate impact of child maltreatment, of course, is that the child is physically hurt, that there's sensory impairment, emotional trauma, and in some cases, very unfortunately, there's death. And there's enormous long-term impact on the child, including the impairment within the brain, low threshold for stress, damage to the area of the brain, increased risk for depression, delinquency, and violent behavior, and reverberating impact across social systems, including the medical, mental health, law enforcement, judicial systems, social service systems, and all those other agencies that are responding to child abuse and neglect and try to provide support and services to the child and to the family. We know that there's enduring impact on the child that refers to the effects of maltreatment within the adult. And there's much research done by the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, a resource by Felitti that is often referred to. The next slide. Understanding the risks associated with child abuse and neglect and preventing the risk of harm has been a primary focus in child welfare. But now there's tremendous growing interest in understanding the factors that protect families who are under stress and promote the resilience of children and youth. The service systems that are part of your system of care can each take a role in promoting the resilience of children, youth, and families by focusing on the capacities and the strengths rather than on deficits and problems. Protective factors are conditions within families and communities that, when present, increase the health and the well-being of children and families. Protective factors are buffers to help individuals find resources, the supports, and strategies that help them function effectively, even under stress. When service providers work with families to increase these protective factors, they also help individuals and families build and draw upon natural support networks within their family and communities. These networks are critical for individuals and families and for long-term success. This webinar validates the philosophy of systems of care and strengthens the capacity of families and young people and has huge implications for children and youth who have experienced child maltreatment. This work, the building protective factors is based on the idea that individuals and families and communities have strengths. This workshop will focus on research on childhood resilience and the capacity of children and youth who have experienced child abuse to adapt successfully and continue to function competently under stress and adversity. There are many lessons learned from the research that Pat will be sharing that have important implications for promoting the mental health and the well-being of children and youth, and how all the systems within systems of care can play a role in promoting resilience. So next slide. In this webinar, Pat will be sharing a definition of resilience, and then her understanding and experience with that, genetic discoveries in resilience, ways of teaching resilience, and resources for building resilience. And then we want to allow at least 15 minutes or more for questions and answers at the end of this discussion. So with that, I'd like to pass it on to Pat.
Okay. Can you hear me? Did I follow my technical directions right, Amy?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. So thank you, Kim. That was a great introduction, and thanks to Amy, who's behind the scenes doing the next slide. And I guess thank you to all of you folks who are out there at your desks and at your offices and your homes and wherever else you happen to be trying to learn about resilience. I love doing this workshop. I will try to make it interesting for all of you. It's kind of a challenge because I usually talk to people and see them, so it's kind of different to do it this way. Before I start this webinar, I'd really like to ask those of you who are participating to answer 3 simple questions for me if you can, either on paper or if you're by yourself and want to just answer it in your mind, that's great too. And we'll talk a little later about these questions and give you all a chance to reflect on how you answered them. The first thing I'd like to ask you is, can you identify a person you remember from your childhood? A person who guided you, who loved you, who supported you, who believed in you. And secondly, what do you remember most about that person? And now, thirdly, as an adult, what part do you think this person has played in shaping who you are today? So we're going to get back to those in a little bit. When I was putting this workshop together, I remember saying to myself, I like this title. Why Some Bounce Back and Some Never Do, Resilience in Children Who Experience Childhood Abuse. But it's more than just a catchy title. I think it meant more to me because it's a question all of us who have worked with children, or maybe even who have looked in a mirror, ask ourselves time and again, why? Why do some children survive and thrive while others just cannot seem to recover, cannot seemingly go beyond the painful memories of their childhood? Doing this research has been really very reassuring. It's provided some real answers to that question, some well-known and accepted theories, some new discoveries, and really some simple old-fashioned common sense. I hope by the end of this webinar you too can better understand some of the reasons why some children bounce back and some never do. Those of you who work with children and families, I'm sure, are well aware of what kids are actually bouncing back from. More than 13 million of them go to bed hungry every night. 3.2 million are reported each year as victims of child abuse and neglect. And children in urban as well as suburban areas report what sociologists are now starting to call parental absence, a lack of a mother or a father who is approachable and attentive and who sets rules and who reinforces consequences. So social scientists have spent decades focusing on these kinds of data and marveled at this strange phenomenon that happens when these children are exposed to these conditions. Not only do many of them survive, but they actually thrive and succeed. So the big question is, what is this resilience all about? You know, how do we define it? How do we teach it? There's lots of questions we need to answer. So we're going to look at the next slide, and let's try to look at how we define resilience. A lot of folks use the words like positive coping, persistence, adaptation, success despite adverse circumstances. Another one is the ability to keep going during difficult times. If you look it up in the dictionary, Webster describes it as the capacity to spring back to the original form or shape after being stretched, bent, or compressed. Flexibility, elasticity. But really for purposes of this webinar, and really so we're all on the same page, let's define resilience as you see it here, the human capacity to face, overcome, and even be strengthened by or transformed by the adversities of life. Next slide. This field has been rapidly expanding over the past 20 years. There's now data to support resilience theories. Some of the research has resulted in us knowing a little bit more now than we did 50 years ago. For example, we now know, as you see here, resilience is not a static thing. It's very dynamic. It's changing in every child, in every situation. It occurs over long periods of time. We're just now beginning to see a few longitudinal studies that trace children who are exposed to trauma and the connections that have helped them come out on the other side, for want of a better term, as healthy, functioning adults. We also know it takes a lot of work. A good analogy, perhaps, is to compare it to muscle development. If we want to increase strength and build our muscle capacity, we have to continually work at it. There isn't a 3-year period, for example, when we're 12 years old and we go to the gym and we work out and we have muscle strength for the rest of our lives. It has to be developed by repeated exercise, by healthy nutrition, an encouraging attitude, and also has to be treated as a lifelong goal. And really, so too is resilience. It isn't something you get at one point and have it from then on. It takes nurturing, a concentrated effort by each of us and those around us to help promote and keep it viable. There's still lots of questions about resilience. There's a few questions around the issue of IQ. It seems to be somewhat related because we've known for some time that children with average or high IQs usually appear to be more resilient than children with lower IQs. We've also noticed that children who are innately cheerful or inanely cheerful also seem to be a bit more resilient. Although there's kind of a question there as to whether their cheerful, happy personalities make them more attractive to others who might then in turn help them survive some of their difficult circumstances. So that's kind of a questionable issue. Next slide. Norman Gourmesi, his work in the 70s has become a watershed for the study of resilience. If you want to look up his name, there's great information about him. He's a professor at the University of Minnesota, and his first work was actually with children of schizophrenic mothers. And he wondered why, despite what most people thought would happen, these children grew up with totally normal development. And he wondered why they were so resilient to problems that people expected them to have. Dr. Ann Maston, another U of Minnesota professor, joined him, and in the 1970s, together they really become the nation's leading researchers in the field of resilience. The quote that you see coming up right now, boy, Amy, you're good at this, is Dr. Maston, and it's a very powerful statement about resilience, and one I find really encouraging. It's not such a mystery, this issue of resilience. It's not about rare qualities or unusual circumstances. It's really about ordinary people and what she calls the magic of relationships. So the research over recent years continues to strive toward answering the ultimate question that we asked earlier, why? Why do some children recover and flourish while some never seem to be able to gain the strength to survive? I hope one of the exciting things you leave this webinar talking about today is that we have discovered some real answers. So next slide, please, Amy. Recently, there's a shift in thinking based on some amazing discoveries. There's been a lot of discussion about genetics and resilience. Those discussions really are based on the way we've always looked at social issues that are related to health issues. For years, we've looked at both genetics and environment as causative factors which work off one another. So take, for example, heart disease. If you're genetically predisposed to heart disease and you add the environmental piece of smoking to the equation, the situation changes. So scientists are finding that this applies to resilience as well. So when they look solely at genes or hereditary factors, the picture seems somewhat incomplete. But when they look at the environment in which a child lives and see that in tandem with genes, then the picture begins to change. In 2003, two researchers from London and the University of Wisconsin, Dr. Moffat and her husband, Dr. Caspi, discovered what's now called the 5-HTT gene. And Amy, if you could just click, there you go. So the 5-HTT gene was discovered by these two professors. And next slide. The 5-HTT gene has two components called alleles, and as you see here at the bottom of this slide, these alleles occur in either a short or a long version. So one may have two shorts or two longs or a combination of one short and one long, but each of us has this 5-HTT gene in some combination. and it's responsible for transporting serotonin to the brain. Now, many of you, I'm sure, know that serotonin regulates mood and behavior, as well as really helping us control our level of stress. So when the serotonin level is properly regulated, it really seems to protect us from depression and leads us to healthier well-being. Scientists have discovered, interestingly enough, that the long versions are 2 times more efficient in transporting serotonin. Next slide. So given that discovery, scientists have found that a person with at least one short version, when stressed, seems to be a bit more prone to depression and less able to handle stressful situations. 2 long versions, on the other hand, seem to act as protective factors when someone's environment seems to fail him or her. Next slide. Dr. Stephen Suomi from the National Institute of Health believed that this genetics and environment theory sounded pretty valid and decided to test it with rhesus monkeys, who incidentally share 90% of our human DNA, including the 5-HTT gene. So he had this massive study. He took 500 monkeys, split them into 2 groups right after they were born. One group stayed with their moms for a normal, nurturing experience, and the other group was put into incubators for the first 2 weeks and then moved into smaller groups where they basically grew up raised by each other, with their peers. When they were 2 to 3 years old, which you may not know is adolescence in monkey years, the groups were reunited. And Suomi and his team noticed remarkable differences between the 2 groups. One extensive experiment that they did involved the reaction of the monkeys to a stranger who entered the lab. Next slide, Amy. Whenever a stranger entered the lab, the peer-raised monkeys ran immediately to the back of the cage, huddling together and clutching each other's fur, clearly distressed. Okay, Amy, next one. After a few minutes, some would venture to the middle of the cage to join the mother-raised monkeys, who consistently stayed in the center of the cages and really rarely noticed or seemed to be bothered at all by the visitor to the lab. Suomi verified that hundreds of times the same experiment occurred, and each time the result was the same. The monkeys who came to join the mother-raised monkeys were tested for the 5-HTT gene and were generally the monkeys with the 2 long versions of the 5-HTT gene. Next slide. Oh, we missed that one. Okay, next slide. Now, Dr. Joan Kaufman from Yale University has been a champion of resilience theories for many, many years, and she decided to try this experiment on humans. So she conducted a fascinating study on 196 children aged 5 to 15 in the state of Connecticut. The children were demographically similar and were divided into 2 groups. One for children removed from their homes after reports of abuse and neglect, and the other a non-abuse group with the same racial makeup and the same family income. She gave all 196 children, you can fill this page out, Amy, she gave all the 196 children a questionnaire which measured their mental health. And she also did DNA testing on each group of children. So next slide. Her findings were pretty amazing. She found that the abused children with 2 short versions of this 5-HTT gene had a higher mean score for depression than the abused children with 2 longs, and the non-abused children, no matter which version they had. This would normally make those of us who work with kids a bit depressed, finding that a child with 2 short versions has a genetic makeup which indicates potential difficulties no matter what we try to do with or for them. But remember at the beginning of the section I told you that scientists believe that the E for environment can have a profound influence on resilience. To test that even further, Dr. Kaufman asked all of the children to name a person they would go to for support, for nurturing, a person who really believed in them. And next slide. No surprise to all of us, she found that the mean depression score for abused children with 2 short versions of the gene, who rarely saw the adults they named, was off the charts. And I think it's the next slide, right, Amy? There's no more on that one? Yes. And interestingly, the children with too shorts, again, too short, who saw the adults they counted on daily or almost daily, their depression scores were very close to the scores of children with too longs or within reach of the children who had not been abused, proving that environment, in other words, these relationships, these important relationships, may actually trump genetics. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later. Given much of this research, and time really has only allowed me to present really a small portion of it to you, scientists are deducing that the 5-HTT gene acts as a buffer to adversity. But it's really important to remember what I said at the beginning of this discussion on genes, that this is a resilience gene, not a prone to depression gene. So if there's no stress or no trauma, whether you have two longs, two shorts, or one of each, is really a moot point. If there's no need for resilience, the 5-HTT gene drops out of the psychological picture completely. It never affects the distribution of serotonin. It's the environment that triggers the gene to kick in. This recent discovery and the findings attached to it may also explain why some children are incredibly resilient with very little support. Their gene may consist of two long versions. But may also help therapists who treat victims of childhood abuse more clearly understand why, despite their continued efforts, some children just can't seem to handle stress in a very effective manner. I'm not sure if all of you find this information as fascinating as I did, but I found myself wanting to know more about this new gene. Do some people just naturally have more long or more short versions? How do you find out which version you have? And I think we're at next slide, Amy. I know we're not spending a lot of time on this, but I thought you might find a few of these facts interesting from the Moffitt study. You see 33% of the white population has two copies of the protective or long version of the gene. African Americans are less likely to have a short. Asians are more likely to have a short. Given what the scientists have discovered, people are wondering, as perhaps you are, and certainly I did when I first read this, how do you know what version of the 5-HTT you have? Recently, a company called Neuromark started selling the 5-HTT test to people whose doctors wrote prescriptions for it. There's even talk in the scientific communities about a miracle drug, you can tell we're in America, being developed which might mimic the 5-HTT's effect on the brain. So it's going to be really interesting to follow this very, very new effort. Next slide. This new genetic discovery leads scientists to ask whether or not environment or good support can ameliorate the effects of abuse and really quite possibly negate a genotype. This is incredibly good news for those of us who work with children and families. Next slide. Whoops, sorry, I jumped ahead of you there. Next slide. There we go. We talked a little earlier about what exactly it is that kids are bouncing back from, and I want to ask you, Amy, if you would just put that whole list on the page, and we'll just look at it. The list you see here just really scratches the surface of problems children face every day, and I know you all can think of many more that aren't up there. Some problems deal with the child, some deal with the child's family, some with the greater community in which he or she may live. These are things that we as social workers, as educators, as law enforcement, clergy, and lots of other helping professions often see when we look at vulnerable children and families. We see all of this stuff. And sometimes it seems like an impossible mission to solve or even to address some of these almost insurmountable social issues. So the new thinking is keep working on these risk factors for sure. But equally important, let's begin to figure out a way to increase the positives in their lives, to build resilience and no longer define families with this negative risk factor frame of mind. One of the most consistent findings in our field deals with the emphasis on protective factors, the elements that build capacity and foster this much-needed resilience in children. If the 5-HTT gene is the genetic piece that buffers adversity, then the protective factors are the environmental piece that buffers adversity. If we can minimize the risks and accentuate the protective factors, then kids have a much better chance of success. Next slide. So what are these protective factors? In looking at resilience, there are protective factors in all kinds of different areas, but the 5 that I'm looking at particularly are the ones that deal with resilience. So these are the primary protective factors that work to reduce risks and build capacity and foster resilience in children. And we're going to go through each of them a little bit. One of the primary protective factors for promoting resilience is caring relationships. These relationships are the ones that convey loving support, ones with a sense of trust, of unconditional love. Some of the ways resilient survivors have described these relationships is really quite interesting. They say they have had people in their lives who have had qualities like quiet availability or simple, sustained kindness. That happens to be my personal favorite. It's these people who have helped them bounce back and be resilient and recover from difficult situations. When we first started this webinar, I asked each of you a few questions about a person in your life who has made a difference for you. So, this is tough, being online and being unable to physically see each other and speak together, but I still do want to take a minute and ask those of you who are here with me today to do a little bit of thinking back to when you were a kid. And if you're by yourself, gosh, that's even better because you have a little peace and quiet. If you're in an office with friends and colleagues working, maybe just a quiet time among you to just think about this. Think about a person in your life who was there for you, who always seemed to be in your corner, someone who saw the good in you and perhaps even more importantly helped you see it in yourself, someone who loved you unconditionally. And when you think of that person, ask yourself how your life might be different if that person had not been a part of it. And I'm going to stop for just a few seconds to let you do that. And I'm also sneaking a drink, which I don't think any of you heard. I'm not sure what your answer was, I think, but consistently the answers I get as I do this workshop are parents, grandparents, coaches, teachers, clergy, even siblings. And the stories are amazing. To see a 65-year-old man stand up at a conference workshop and tell me he remembers his grandmother sitting with him on the back porch and telling him that there was no one in the world she was more proud of still brings tears to my eyes. He told us that whenever life got hard for him, her face and her voice came back to him, and his feeling of worth came back to him as well. As I travel around the country doing this work, I often tell people there's someone else standing up here on the podium with me. You don't see her, but I know she's there. She's the reason I do this work. She's the one person who would, if she were still alive, be the most proud and perhaps the least surprised at my success. It's so reassuring that finally research has begun to support what a difference a caring relationship makes in a child's life. You also see up here listed another factor that we use as a tool to build and enhance resilience, and that's high expectations. We really need to cultivate as parents and mentors the idea of setting the bar high for children in our families and in our work. And that bar, when it's set with caring support, we just talked about, results in resilience and strength. Children who are continuously challenged to achieve and at the same time encouraged and supported to achieve are the ones who eventually become resistant to the difficulties that they face in life. Children who have structure and purpose and goals are much less likely to be scattered and unattached to their families, to their friends, and to their community. How many times have we all heard the phrase, this is all anyone ever expected him to be, and it's exactly what he's become. Well, resilience is about helping kids see themselves in a better place. It's about teaching them to believe that they can be more. It's harder for them to do alone. Having people around them who continuously challenge them to succeed and who encourage them if they occasionally fail makes it so much more doable. The third protective factor you see that builds capacity in children and promotes resilience, and it's really a tool for us to use, is the ability to believe in oneself and the idea that your life can make a difference. So many of us grew up struggling to find meaning for things that happen to us, struggling to find a way to cope with a world that, quite honestly, we never really asked to be in. Without the armor of believing in ourselves, the going can get pretty tough. This belief and support can come from the most unexpected places. One of the most memorable examples of this came to me from a woman I worked with several years ago. She was, without a doubt, one of the most amazing women I have ever met. When she was little, she lived near a huge army base, and her mother used to have sex with pretty much any soldier who happened to come by. I'll name her Kim, I'll make up her name. When Kim was 6 years old, her mother began to offer her to the soldiers for money. And this went on until Kim was 12. And one day when she and I were talking, I asked her who in her life helped her to believe in herself and become who she is today, a leader in child abuse prevention within her state and an exemplary mother of 3. Her answer still astounds me. She said, when I was in first grade, I had a teacher who was so kind, so nurturing, so sensitive. She always took me under her wing. I remember one day we were getting ready to go on a field trip, and she sat the entire class down and said, "My, look at Kim. Doesn't she look so pretty today? What a sweet little dress." To this day, Kim recalls it was a little blue checkered dress, and she blushes when she recalls how proud she felt, how important she thought she was for that brief moment. That teacher has, I am sure, passed away without realizing that a 46-year-old woman still remembers her words, and their meaning remains inspirational. Why do I tell you this story? Because it's the little things, the seemingly insignificant things, that often mean the most, often help children believe in themselves again, or maybe even for the first time. The fourth protective factor that we use as a tool to build resilience is a positive outlook and humor. It used to be that behaviorists believed that positive emotions in the face of extreme adverse events was really a form of unhealthy denial. But recently, they're finding that a positive attitude and positive emotions are actually can reduce the levels of distress by quieting and literally undoing negative emotions. So what does this say to us about those of us who work with kids? It says, lighten up, help kids laugh, help children see that there's a different way to look at things and at people, and maybe even at you. Some of the most valuable lessons I've learned as the mother of 3 have been learned with a smile on my face, and I'm sure each of you has worked with kids, who has worked with kids can also say that. The world is dark and gloomy enough, so help kids see a little bit of sunlight. I remember talking to a social worker when I was a little kid, and I was describing our latest family move. My dad is a violent alcoholic, often wanted by the police. We moved at night a lot. I was in 13 schools by the time I was in 8th grade. And when I told the social worker, when I told her this move seemed to be different because we moved in the afternoon. She smiled and said, "Yeah, it's much easier moving in the daylight." I remember that because rather than feeling sorry for me, she made me smile and put the move in a more positive perspective. And really, to this day, I tell people, when I was little, I never realized you could move during the day. And that attitude has come from a social worker who had a great sense of humor. And sometimes it's the kids that have a positive attitude, and we benefit from them. One of my favorite child protective workers working in a very large urban center with multiple problems used to invite one of the 7-year-old boys she had in her care out to McDonald's whenever she needed inspiration. She sat with him and watched this broad smile fill his face and marveled at how he could be so positive, so excited, so enthusiastic at 7 years old, given his sad circumstances. When she left him, she felt like she could continue because he had so inspired her to keep doing the work. And I promise I'll move the screen soon, but first let's talk for a minute about the 5th bullet we see here, another wonderful tool for teaching and reinforcing resilience, and that's problem-solving skills. Children who are able to solve or in some way address everyday puzzles by trying something new or different are, for the most part, more resilient. If we can help children develop abstract thinking, to be more flexible and learn to find alternative solutions, particularly in social situations, we're really well on our way to building resilient children. One social worker I know always makes every possible effort to involve the children she works with in some sort of decision-making process around their situation. She believes, and research is now supporting, that teaching children they can have a direct impact on their lives and their decisions can be part of a solution. They learn how to develop self-confidence, which is, of course, a major tool in increasing resilience. So these are just 5 things that we can begin to do to build resilience in the children within our families and within our communities. Let's look, if we can, for a few minutes at what we need to do within ourselves. Next slide, Amy. People are so glad to get rid of that slide, right? Believing that resilience is possible, especially in very traumatic situations, means that you really rely or believe in what we call the resilience principles. Without these basic principles, it's really hard to imagine anyone would think that a child might recover or indeed thrive after a difficult childhood. If we want to believe that resilience is possible, we absolutely have to buy into these 4 concepts. We have to be able to make 4 assumptions about human nature and the world that we live in. The first one is that people can change. They can adapt. No one is beyond our help or beyond their own ability to grow, and that's a huge piece. And secondly, all people have the potential for good. Wasn't it Anne Frank who said, despite everything, I believe people are really good at heart? Again, this is about finding goodness somewhere and building on it. And it's also about the next concept, which is hope. When I travel around the country doing this child abuse prevention work, people always say, gosh, this must be so depressing. And I always say, no, it's so hopeful. It's so much about hope. And then also about trust. A lot of our children and families we deal with, trust has been ruptured or destroyed. So it's important that we rebuild it, and that's essential to their recovery and to their resilience. And next slide. Along with these resilience principles, we also have to be grounded in a set of beliefs about families and the incredible power that these families possess. We have to trust in our hearts that certain things can happen. Many parents can learn how to create safe, stable, and nurturing environments that can help their children develop into healthy individuals. And also, if they receive proper services and support, many families can actually resolve their own issues and crises within their own family. So why is it so important for parents and other caregivers and those of us who work with children to promote resilience, and how do we do it? It's important because, as you see here, and as many of you continuously see, the situations children face every day within their families and their communities can be overwhelming. Without the safe and nurturing relationships we talked about today, and without the support and self-confidence we all know is necessary, the crisis they fail will win. And their level of resilience to stress and to trauma will lessen, or perhaps worse yet, never develop. So we talk a little bit about you as providers of services, as parents, as concerned mentors, things you can do, things you should believe in. Let's take a moment and just see how this information might inform the work that you're doing, how it might possibly change the system of care for the people that you're serving. Next slide, Amy. Some of you may be aware of the Strengthening Families for Early Care and Education movement that Kim referred to. It's currently in place in more than 30 states in our country, and it's based on the idea that child care providers and parents working together make a great team. Strengthening Families has taught us to change the system of care for preschoolers and their families. This philosophy has turned child care centers into a resource for parents as well as children. No longer do parents view their child center as a place where they drop the kids off at 7:30 and pick them up at 5. Now it's also a place for them. There are resources and programs available on critical issues like potty training and discipline. There are evenings planned strictly for parents to get out and to interact and learn from each other. And some centers have a Craigslist where parents exchange goods and services. Well, how did all this happen? A new philosophy about encouraging protective factors in families has become their standard for operation. In strengthening family centers, parents are recognized for what they're doing right. The good, strong qualities that every family has are recognized and are honored. One of our goals today is to pose the possibility of such a sea change in your field. What might happen if we applied these resilience tools in this new way of thinking about positive factors to your work, and how might we do it? What would happen, I guess, is probably best answered by each of you sitting out there because you're the experts in this field. It might be interesting for you to see how we made this change in the Strengthening Families program, though. Any systems change usually means a power change, but we don't call it that because many people would run away from that. Giving up power isn't really a very popular thing. But in reality, that's what it is. Some of the power shifts. Rather than continually providing children or families with strengths and resources, we become the vehicles through which they find those assets within themselves. We found, as I'm sure you'll find in your work for some, that that's a slippery and uncomfortable slope to travel. But in the long run, it's a far more successful route. So how did we change this mindset in early childhood providers and therefore the system of care for little ones? I think any system change begins with individuals. In strengthening families, it began with the folks at the Center for the Study of Social Policy who believe that there's a better way to prevent child abuse and neglect, especially in the youngest and most vulnerable victims, preschool-age children. And there was a segment of the population that needed to begin to play a more active role, the child care providers. So those providers began, as you may, as a small band of people who believed in the power of families and the strengths that they possess, and then how to capitalize on those strengths. Small pilot programs began, as they easily could with all of you, and slowly the focus and therefore the system began to change. Teams began to develop where parents and families were equal players, and the power shifted. The dialogue changed, and therefore the work began to change. I think this resilience work is a critical part of that dialogue and that change in thinking, leaning toward the positive and reinforcing strengths. Next slide, Amy, please. In the interest of time, to get back to some resources for each of you, one resource is the International Resilience Project, which was once headed by the late Dr. Edith Grafberg. She's a developmental psychologist from Alabama. And she worked with the Bernard Van Leer Foundation in the Netherlands and collaborated with representatives from 30 countries around the issues of resilience. And the result of their efforts was a practical guide that's intended to help adults promote resilience. It focuses not only on the child, but on his or her setting and environment. And we're going to leave this up for a second while I just explain to you briefly what this is. Their research is interesting and simple, and what's wonderful for all of you is very replicable. They found that in order for children to overcome the adversities they face in life, they have to have three sources or components of resilience, and they are external support, inner strength, and social and interpersonal skills. So what does that mean? Well, it means when you sit down with a child, with a family, you ask them to complete these three phrases. I have, I am, I can. And when you look at I have, you're going to ask them to give an example of external supports. And this would be things like relationships, structures, role models. So they might answer, I have people around me I trust, who love me no matter what. I have people who set limits for me, who show me how to do things right by their example. So these are the external support someone has. The next thing is the I am, which is the internal and personal strength. So you might sit with a child and say, talk to me a little bit about your feelings, your attitudes, your beliefs, your philosophies, and start the sentence with I am. So you might have kids or families say, I'm a person people can like. I'm respectful of others. I'm willing to be responsible for what I do. I'm accountable. I'm sure things will be all right. And then the last one they ended up with is the I CAN, which is the social and interpersonal skills. And this is skills like communicating, problem solving, how to manage impulses. So you might have somebody say, I can, and they might say, I can talk to others when I have a problem. I can find ways to solve my problems. I can control myself when I feel like doing something that's not right or dangerous. I can look for help when I need it. None of these sources of resilience can solely sustain a child and make him or her more likely to be resilient. They really only seem to be effective when they work together. So, for example, if a child has a great deal of self-esteem but doesn't have the social skills to problem solve, then his resilience factor is going to be lowered. If she is loved but has no inner strength to help her believe in herself, she's less likely to be resilient to stress or to trauma. Next slide, Amy. Another source you all may be very familiar with is information from the Search Institute in Minneapolis, Minnesota. They're wonderful. For almost 3 decades, they've developed measurements to assess the developmental stages of children, and often they've also included protective factors necessary to increase that resilience. Their materials are translated into 14 languages, and they give a wealth of free resources and tools that can be used to build capacity for resilience in children really as young as 3 and up to age 18. So you see their website there, and if you don't have it in front of you, it's www.search-institute.org/assets. So as we conclude this webinar, I hope each of you who has patiently listened will look at resilience in a new light. You may remember one of the definitions I mentioned at the beginning of the program was the capacity to spring back to the original form or shape after being stretched. Make no mistake that like rubber bands, kids do bounce back. But let's also not forget, or let's not deny, that the stretching part often hurts. It's incumbent upon those of us who parent or who work with children to ease that hurt and to help them bounce back to safe, healthy, and well-adjusted children. And I think this next slide is what we have put together to show you some websites that you all might visit. I also would like to just add, which I did not give to Kim and Amy, and I apologize, 2 books, both of them by Dr. Grossberg, who's just wonderful. Gottberg, I'm sorry, I've been saying that wrong the whole time. One is called Resilience for Today, Gaining Strength from Adversity, and it's edited by Dr. Grotberg, Grotberg. And the other one is How to Deal with Anything. Sounds like something we should all read. Also edited by Dr. Grotberg. Both of these, by the way, I got one of them for a penny from Amazon.com because it's a used book. So they're great books. And so, Kim, and Amy, thank you. You did a great job for me. I appreciate it. And I don't know who does this from here on in.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Pat. That was just wonderful, just a wealth of information about research that many of us probably haven't heard of, a wealth of resources, and many, many wonderful ideas about ways to really support young people and families in new ways and validating the ways that many of us have been working. At this point in the conversation, I'd like to ask anyone who would like to ask a question or share a thought with Pat to just press *7 on your line to unmute your line. And we just want to welcome any thoughts or comments, thoughts about how this relates to the work that you're doing in communities.
Well, it's either very good or very bad, or they've all left.
No, actually, we have quite a number of folks on the line, so everybody is muted. You'll have to hit *7 to unmute your line to speak.
Yeah, we had one request to put the last slide back up so we can write down some of those resources, and then we had another request on how to get a copy of the PowerPoint.
This is Amy. Everyone who registered for this event earlier today. If you didn't, we will also be posting these slides to our website probably next week, along with the playback recording of this presentation, and we'll be sending an email to everyone who registered when that's available. So if you didn't register and you didn't get the emails today, you can either check back on the TA Partnership website next week, or you can send me an email. My email address is amjohnson, JOHNSON, @AIR.org, and I can email you a copy of the slides.
This is Kim again. I just want to say that these slides, I think, are tremendously helpful in terms of thinking about how you might communicate with your systems partners, with providers, with folks who are supporting young people all across your community, in terms of thinking about ways that they can really play an incredible role in really transforming the lives of young people and families, in promoting their protective factors and their resilience in adverse situations. But I really want to stress that these slides were really developed by Pat Stanilewski, and she did a tremendous job of really capturing an enormous amount of research and work. So if you're going to share them, please refer to her on any of these slides that are being used, or anything that you're taking from these slides and sharing with others. Pat, do you also have a website at this stage in the game? I know Partnering for Prevention is a new organization.
It's brand new, and I do not have one yet, and I really have to work on that, but it's only been up about 5 weeks.
Okay.
Well, and I just want to share with whoever's still out there, and it looks like a lot of people still are. This we could really spend. I mean, I do this as an hour-and-a-half workshop, and Kim will laugh when I say this, but I had 56 slides, and she made me cut it down. So good for her. I bet you're all happy about that. But I think we could spend a full day talking about this, especially this piece at the end on talking to children and doing the I have, I am, I can. I've seen that used with therapists, and it's amazing the results that come from children looking at a kind of a self-assessment of themselves, and really how exciting it is that they find so many strengths and so many positive things that they didn't really think they had. So that piece alone, my gosh, we could spend a good hour and a half just on that piece. So my apologies to the group, because I do think that this is a very, very quick brushstroke of what resilience is about.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Pat, and I know that the contact information is on the last slide for anyone who wants to follow up with you, and I'm hopeful that folks will follow up with you and contact you in thinking about what kinds of opportunities there might be for having further discussions around this within their particular community. And I also, when I was reading that slide about I have, I am, I can, and even your very, very brief description, and I know you could have gone into much more detail, I also had some thoughts about how that could be utilized in a community or adapted for a resource for young people. And I wonder if there's anyone on the line who had additional thoughts about how these resources, the information could be used to develop resources or supports for families and young people in your community. You just hit *7 if you'd like to add to that thought.
Hello, my name is Angie, and I'm with Erie County in Buffalo, New York. And my question was related to the exercise we've been talking about. How can you apply that, or do you have a resource you might be able to point me to specifically for working with that concept with kids through an artistic therapeutic form?
I'm not sure if I totally heard your question. Did you hear it better than I did, Kim?
Yeah, is Angie, is that right, from Erie County, Septima Care, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Angie was asking if you know the slide on I have, I am, and I can. She was asking if have you had any thoughts or if you've heard anything about how that's used in artistic expression.
In artistic, are you saying, or with autistic
like
children?
Like in art therapy or creative expression?
I have not heard it. First, I thought you said autistic, and actually, the book that's edited by Dr. Grotberg actually deals with using the I have, I am, I can with special needs children and families. So that's just a side note, which of course you didn't say, did you? I have not heard it used as part of art therapy, but you know, this one book I told you about, Resilience for Today, really is almost completely about that whole piece. So if you're able to get it at Amazon.com, it lists many ways to use that philosophy. So I have not seen in that book, and I don't remember reading in that book anything about using it in art therapy. But boy, I have a daughter who's a graphic artist and is getting into teaching art and working with children with art therapy. So I'm sure that all I've talked to her about as far as resilience is you can use art in just about anything. I mean, gosh, that's just such a wonderfully expressive and really sometimes safe vehicle for kids.
I completely agree, and I just wanted to thank you for sharing this material. I thought it was incredibly interesting, and I will definitely be looking at the resources you've shared. So thank you.
Well, thank you for doing the work you're doing. I did the easy part. You guys are doing the hard part.
You know, Angie, if you end up using those ideas in kind of artistic expression with young people, in terms of, you know, who they have in terms of relationships. I mean, I can just imagine them having an opportunity to draw that out.
Mm-hmm.
And as Pat was saying, you know, that's a tremendous vehicle for many young people who can't communicate in words. It's just too uncomfortable or difficult. And it also is a great opportunity in a group to have a way to share different perspectives around those relationships is important ways in which they're handling some very difficult things to learn from one another. And I was just thinking, wouldn't it be great if you could share any artwork, if you are able to create anything in Erie County with Pat for the future, because I'm just thinking that, boy, that would really tell a great story.
Oh yeah, and I would say that to all of the folks who are still with us. I think part of what makes all of us be able to do our work more effectively is we learn from each other. And every time I do a workshop or any time I'm presenting this material, I always leave thinking I've learned more from the people than they've probably learned from me. So by all means, share it and get back to us because it just makes this information so much richer.
I had one comment, just an idea that came to mind. This is Stephanie Norton with the System of Care Community in Fort Worth, Texas, and we're an early childhood site. And I was just thinking, we're going to be using the wraparound process with our families, and I think with using the I have, I am, and I can, that's a great way to start the strengths discovery, or maybe some way to incorporate that into the strengths discovery part of the wraparound process. Have you seen any other communities using that?
I haven't seen them using it around the wraparound, but you're absolutely right. You're absolutely on target. I think it'd be an amazing way to start it. Because the results that we've seen from these discussions, even with very little kids, has really been, I think it's surprised some people. And it has been a very nice jumping off place. So yes, I think that's a great idea.
Hi Pat, this is Amy. We had one question come in online.
Mm-hmm.
And the question is, are there any trainings on resiliency available for local district Department of Social Services staff that you would recommend?
I'm going to tell you that I honestly don't know anybody else. I know the researchers who are doing it, but I don't know people who are presenting it. I've done it so many times at national conferences and around the country, and I'm always kind of looking for a colleague to to refer people to, because sometimes it gets to be a little too much for me to handle. But I do a lot of it, and then I'm hoping that as you guys who are listening to this today kind of pick this up and maybe get this this information, particularly these books from Amazon. I mean, I think any of you could do this kind of work. But I do it, but honestly, I just don't know other colleagues around the country who are doing it.
Yeah, I just want to add to that, though, Pat, that I think that there's a couple of resources that you identified on your slides, and maybe Amy can go back to that again, the additional resources.
Mm-hmm.
The Friends National Resource Center for Community-Based Child Abuse Prevention provides support to all the state agencies across the country that promote child prevention services.
Trust funds.
Right, and the children's trust funds within states. And their focus now is increasingly focused around building protective factors and promoting resiliency. And there's some wonderful resources that they're developing around how to help state agencies to begin to incorporate that thinking. The other resource that you have on here is the Center for the Study of Social Policy, which has some wonderful resources on their website, and all of their strengthening families efforts across the country. And I don't even know how many sites there are. I think probably better than 20 sites across the country. Might be another way to connect up and learn about how they're strengthening the protective factors, particularly in early childhood education, that social service agencies may be able to play a role with that. So there's opportunities for linkages and connections, and I think those two particular resources might be a place for starting in terms of this shift in thinking about protective factors and strengthening the way agencies are serving families.
Well, and actually those resources, that's why I said you folks can do this. If you go to any of these, and Kim's absolutely right, the gateway information, the CSFT information, information from friends, gives you a wealth of knowledge, and if you just take a little bit of time and do some reading and have, the ability, and you're not afraid to speak up and do presentations, pretty much a lot of you, I'm sure, can do these on your own, because this is a fascinating field and just now beginning to really open up. And the positive focus has just been wonderful to see how the results that have come from that.
Any other questions? You can hit *7.
Hi, I have a question.
Hi there. Can you tell us your name and where you're from?
Yes, this is Rebecca Milliman. I'm from Seattle, Washington, at an agency called Children's Response Center. We serve children who have been through abuse and trauma, and I do prevention education. And I had a question. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more on the factor of the age in which the child experienced the trauma. You hear this phenomenon of, if the child experienced the trauma or abuse earlier in life, there's higher outcomes for resilience. And I just found it really fascinating, your whole discussion about the genetic factors too. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more to that question about, does the age that the trauma occurred make a significant difference?
Oh boy, that's an age-old question. I've been doing child abuse prevention for probably almost close to 30 years, and I can probably balance on one hand the people who would say it does make a difference, and I can balance on the other hand research that shows and experts who claim that it doesn't. I think some of the information that might answer that portion of the question might come to you from the Search Institute. There's a lot of information there, and they also have, as it relates to preschool age kids right up to age 18. And I think you might find some information there that would be really helpful. I think that's where I've seen the most reference to that issue. I don't know if I can personally answer that because again I've heard both sides so often. That's one of the age-old ones. That one sits right up there with, is it happening more, or are we just hearing more about it? Those are as a prevention person, you have to have addressed that question 100 times. But the genetic piece, and I really only touched very briefly on that because we had such a time limit. But the genetic piece, you can also find more information by, when you get the slides, by Googling the folks who are listed in here, Moffat and Caspi. There's really even more information than I was able to give to all of you.
Thanks, Pat. Is there any other questions?
We've had a couple submitted online. One is just, Pat, could you please list the names of the books that you mentioned before again?
Sure. One is called Resilience for Today, and it's got a subtitle under it called Gaining Strength from Adversity, and it's edited by Edith Grotberg, Grotberg, and that's the one I told you has huge sections in dealing with the I have, I am, I can, and also talks about that in relationship to working with families versus working with children, working with exceptional children, working in bicultural communities. It's a very, very interesting book, and I think that might be the one I got for a penny. I can't remember. The other one is a very small book, and it's called How to Deal with Anything, and again by Edith Grotberg. And this one talks a little bit also about that process, and also talks a lot about building trust and creating initiative and about interpersonal relationships. What else? Does some stuff on the role of your cultural beliefs and resilience. And then also does an interesting section on natural disasters, talking about how resilience is played out in natural disasters. So both of them are very interesting books and pretty quick reading.
Great, thank you. The other question we have online is with respect to the genetic test mentioned earlier. Do you know the avenue by which people could access more information on getting the test and information on how to utilize it?
I thought that would be the number one question that people gave us. I thought that would pop up right away. The company that I mentioned is Neuromark, Neuromark, right? Mm-hmm. That's it. I believe right now the only way, this is a genetic testing company, and I believe right now the only way that they will give people this test kit and test which of the versions you have is with a prescription from a physician. We can't just write to them and find out about it. So I actually tried to find out a lot more about this before I went on today because I wanted to give people any more updated information, but I haven't found anything more recent than what I found in the research, just listing the name of the company. They do have a contact us at the bottom of their website, so we may have a whole bunch of you that were here today contact them. I don't know, but that is what they started doing.
Great, thank you. Any other questions? Please hit *7 if you have any other questions. Okay, Tad, I think we've wound up all the questions at this stage in the game, and I just want to thank you so much for taking the time not only to cut down all those wonderful, wonderful slides into a presentation for this, because I know there was a tremendous amount of work, but sharing with us some really positive and hopeful opportunities and ways that we can strengthen our work with our families all across the country. So I really want to thank you so much. It's been wonderful hearing your perspectives.
Well, thank you, and again, thanks to the people out there who are really doing the work.
Okay, thank you to all of you who joined us today, and you'll be receiving more information, the PowerPoint, and an evaluation of this webinar. Thank you. Have a great day.
The evaluation form should be on your screen right now if you're participating on the online portion. If you could just take a minute to fill that out, we'd appreciate it. And if you are not with us on the online portion today, we will be emailing out a link to this evaluation form next week with the information on how to access the recording. So thank you, everyone.
Have a great day.
Are we staying on, Kim? Kim?
Sorry, Pat, it's muted.